Alright, this is the second video I'm making on my 2025 Honda Odyssey. All dusty and already in good heavy usage. And in my earlier video I talked about wanting to build a cargo floor in this van so I could use it for cargo, which will be about 90% of my usage. One of the things I touched on in that video was that kudos to Honda for making the inner cargo area panels or rear seat panels just a little bit wider than a 4-foot wide piece of plywood, so you can actually slide it in there. Now you do come up pretty close to the seat belts, but it does go through there. When sliding the plywood in, I did have to kind of finesse it a little bit to one side, try not to get the seat belt caught on it, and then reach in and pull the seat belt, you know, kind of down and to the back to get the plywood in. But it does go in. It is just slightly wider than the plywood now, but the plywood slid all the way as far forward as it can go, hitting the rear of the center console. This plywood has been cut 8 inches shorter than the usual 8 foot. I crawled in here with this plywood as far forward as it would go and found that the plywood would hit the inside of the door if it was 8 feet long. It's got 2 inches that if they had made it so it didn't have, or that it was 2 inches smaller than it is, you could have actually got a couple sheets of 4x8 in here without cutting them. But that's confirmation what I said earlier, that you cannot fit a 4x8 sheet of plywood into the rear of the Odyssey without cutting it down a little bit in the long dimension. Now again, I cut it 8 inches because I didn't have an exact measurement. I just wanted to make sure it would fit. No questions, and it turned out I could have had them just cut 2 inches off and it would have just barely fit, or 3 inches and it would have definitely fit. So maybe that's of use to somebody else. Anyway, you could slide almost all of a 4x8 sheet of plywood in here and have the rear end of it. Unfortunately, the sun is not doing me any favors here today with the glare. You could have the rear of the plywood sitting on this, which is, I think, a structural member. It's got plastic as a top finish, but I think it's steel under there. So that, I think, can hold the weight. And immediately, if you go forward to that, you're into the seat backs for the folding third row seats. And I don't really want to put weight on those because they're spongy. I want the weight to be held by something a little firmer. Now if you were just going to slide stuff in from the back, you could just slide in your piece of slightly trimmed 4x8 and brace it at some points down to the actual floor and be done. But in my usage, I want to be able to use this space here for the side doors. I need to find out how far in the door goes into this space when the door is closed, and from that I can figure out exactly if I can build this out at all, or if I can only go 4 feet wide there. Alright, with the plywood pretty much centered in the vehicle and measuring out 8 inches is pretty much touching there behind the speaker, and then there's a little more room there. It's widest right here just behind the speaker. So if you build it out about 8 inches, that would be about as much as you could go with it. and probably better to be an inch shy of that, maybe 7 inches. So even if it goes a little bit sideways, it won't be hitting and rubbing on the inside of the door. So with the plywood moved forward of this recess for the rear door latch point, that's about as far back as it can go. I know that because I lowered the door and pushed the plywood back until I hit the door and moved it forward about 3/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch, just a little bit of clearance so it wouldn't be rubbing on the door with, you know, bounces and things. And this is where it ended up. So really, it could go up to right here and still not actually hit the door any further back, and it'll impact the door when the door is closing. So that's a good reference mark to use if you're fitting a cargo floor in here. So visualize the door inside panel going straight up from about here. Now I don't want the cargo floor to go all the way up, and there's a couple reasons for that. Number one, I'm fairly short in terms of leg length, so I have the seat a bit further forward than a lot of drivers would have. And I have to allow for, if I take it in for service, they might want to run the seats back a little bit so they can sit in the seat properly, and I don't want to have the cargo floor keeping the seat from going back at least a little bit. And I'm thinking having it about even with the rear of the center console would be a good compromise. So I'm going to mark that on the carpet and try to see if I can extend that out to the sides. Now here's the assembly that the middle row seats or the second row seats clip onto, and it does stick up pretty far off the floor. I'm going to measure it here. It's about 3 3/4 above the actual height of the floor. So 3 3/4 up. You can't really have the cargo floor be any lower than that because of this protuberance. I wish it wasn't that high. It'll just make it that much harder to slide things in through the side door. But already you've got Honda's decision to have this low, this higher. You already have something on the order of 1.5 inches height difference just because of this unfortunate thing. So the cargo floor is going to have to be that high. That's all there is to it. And you have to keep in mind then that with that cargo floor, your maximum height from the cargo floor is about just under 39 inches, or it won't go in through the doorway. And actually it can't even be that high because the ceiling drops lower than the door quite a bit. So in reality it's about 38 inches. If you're higher than 38 inches, cargo won't go in here if it's sitting on a floor of that height. The other thing I want to be able to do here is put a bit of a lip on the front of the cargo floor so that things won't slide forwards of that into the back seats. Now, I want to have the cargo floor extend wider than the 4-foot width of a piece of plywood, about 7 inches out along here. So obviously I can't do that with this one piece of plywood. So my thinking is have the one piece of plywood come up to just about maybe even with this. Never mind this slope back, but kind of like even with this. And then have this area be another piece of plywood that's been cut the long way so that it's a separate piece from this piece back here. So it'll be a 2-piece floor. I originally thought I'd make it 3 pieces by cutting that part in half, just to make the pieces more manageable, and you could do that. But there's also issues of articulation, so when you're trying to slide some cargo in here, if the pieces all don't line up at exactly the same height, you're going to have issues with the cargo catching on those edges. So I'm thinking keeping it down to the minimum number of pieces is probably a good thing. So I have one sheet of plywood I bought here. And I have another piece of the same thing. By the way, this is sort of a, it's a two-sided or two-sanded sided 3/4 inch piece of plywood. It's about $50 a sheet from Home Depot. So it's not crap plywood. I decided that for my situation I wanted to have a smoother finish on it, even though it's just a very thin veneer. I may put some kind of a carpeting on top of this. I haven't yet decided. But I didn't want it to be full of all the usual knots and big cracks and things that you get on plywood that doesn't have finished surfaces. So I paid the extra money to get the finished surfaces. This piece is the one I can cut to make the section of the cargo floor that'll go between the 2 sliding doors, and there'll be a fair amount of scrap off of that, obviously. Now the other thing I did is I bought 4 pieces of premium 2x4 in 8-foot lengths. So these don't have a whole lot of knots in them. They're pretty smooth wood by and large. They're fairly straight. And they're not sappy either. That was something I wanted to avoid. A lot of the 2x4s they have are just still oozing sap. I didn't want that getting on the carpet, so I got ones that were a little more expensive. Still, I think they were just a few bucks per each 2x4. So the next thing I'm going to do is figure out exactly where I need to have the separation point between the 2 panels. So I have a piece of painter's tape going along what'll be the front edge of the cargo floor. So it has a little bit of clearance. From this angle it looks like there's more, but it really only gives you about 1 inch, 3/4 of an inch from the tape to the back of this center console at its widest point at the top there. And that more or less lines up with the door. So I'm thinking that'll be the front, and then I'll have to taper it a little bit. Now I need to mark where the 7-inch mark is coming off of this in this direction. And again, I've marked the plywood should not go beyond this inner edge of the tape here. So let's take a look at it from the front and make sure that still looks reasonable. Yep. It'll be about half the width of the tape clearance between the widest part of the inner door structure and where the wood ends. So that's about right. Yep. Same fit on the other side. If you're just measuring off the side of the plywood to do this, I wouldn't recommend it because very small angular adjustments in where that piece of plywood there is laying can throw you off by at least 1 inch towards the front. It's better to measure off of something fixed on the vehicle itself. Alright, I've got that marked. And I figured if I want to have a wing sticking out this way and still have reasonable clearance, it can go to about this point here, which I'm going to measure on both sides, draw a line between it, and that'll be the separation between the rear panel and the front panel. And that'll also, from the tape line here, give me the width of the front panel. Then everything else is just trimming. Now the other thing I need to do at this point, now that I've established where the peripheries of the boards are going to be, I need to figure out how thick the risers are going to be that are going to actually support the weight. I could have some of the weight supported on this, and I might still do so. It's pretty heavy plastic, but I need to have the front edge supported for sure, and I need to have support here, right behind the cut line, and at least one other point going back. Probably supporting the front part at the front edge and a little bit here on the seat rail assembly, and another piece right at the back edge right by the cut line, and then have the rear piece have a riser, something more or less in the middle, and then have the rear edge sitting up on the rear lip of the cargo deck there, or the cargo opening. That should be probably strong enough. And then I may have to do something out here towards the edges as well on this piece to make for more accurate riser dimensions. The risers, again, are the things that are going to rest down on the carpeting and go up and actually support the plywood. So I have a 2x4, 8-foot 2x4 resting on the rear lip there. Sorry about the glare once again. I'll go around here just to make sure it shows up properly. Just setting up there. And resting on the second row seat rail assembly, whatever we want to call that. And now it's a lot easier to take dimensions off the bottom edge of that down to the carpet and add about 1/4 of an inch, because the carpet's a little springy. Once it actually has weight on it, it's going to compress probably about 1/4 of an inch. I don't think it's going to hurt. Again, this is really solid, heavy plastic. If weight's just sitting on this, I don't think anything's going to happen, but I'd rather not have it scarred up. As a matter of fact, I might actually, when I'm using the cargo floor here, I might get an old towel or something and throw it across this just to have a small barrier between it and the wood. Anyway, I'm going to take some dimensions now. Now here's a place where I almost made a big mistake. I have the 2x4 sitting here, but this handle area sticks up better part of an inch. I need to measure to this, not to that. And this handle assembly, I don't think, is designed to take as much straight down weight as this area is, so I need to build in even a little bit more of a buffer for that. So I need to actually bring this like this to get the actual dimension. And I've taken a quick sort of snapshot dimension with just the plywood in place, and it was about 5 inches. And so it's 4 3/4 here, but I haven't compressed the carpeting. Yeah, if I compress the carpeting, it's just about 5 inches, so I need to probably go up about 5 1/8 inch just to be safe. And that'll also give a little room for the thickness of the towel in there. Alright, I'm going to put this sketch on my file share webpage, and I'll mention it in the video. I'll include the link to find the PDF file, which will be available there, but right now I'll just go through it. So, cargo floor plans to fit 2025 Honda Odyssey, and probably also the 2017 through 2024 models, because they're the same basic design with only minor tweaks. No liability implied or given. All this is a document of what I did for my own van, and I'm sharing it, but I don't make any promises how well it'll work for anybody else. And if they do something with theirs that causes injury or damage to property, I've got nothing to do with that. Use at your own risk, in other words, and with your own discretion. So the cargo floor has got a front panel, or front platform you could call it, and a rear panel or platform. Each one is made out of a 4x8 sheet of 3/4 inch plywood, cut down. If you have trouble transporting larger boards in your own vehicle, don't have a minivan yet, for example, you could probably have the lumberyard cut the 2 sheets of plywood you buy for you, so you wouldn't have to do any major cutting. The front panel is 63 inches on the long dimension by 33 1/4 inches on the short dimension. The rear panel is 59 1/2 inches the long way and 48 inches or 4 feet the short way. So this is basically a 4x8 sheet of plywood cut in the long dimension to 59.5 inches. And the cut-off piece of wood that remains of that one sheet of plywood can come in handy for making some of the bits and pieces, such as the spacers up here or the buttresses that are down here, as can the cut-off piece from this sheet of plywood as well. I also used several 2x4s of 8-foot length. There are, well, I don't know what to call these. I never did decide what to call these. I'm going to call them joists right now, but they'll get called stringers, risers, ribs, all sorts of things during the course of the video. But right now I'm going to call them joists. So the first one in the front is 5.5 inches, and it's 1.5 inches wide. So that's the width of a 2x4. If you get 2 2x4s and cut them to 63 inches, and then glue one endwise onto the other, and then after the glue is dried, cut the whole thing down to 5.5 inches, you'll have one of these boards. You do similarly to get the 4.5 board here, and again to get the 4.5 board here. Although in this case, because a 2x4 is naturally 3.5 inches long, wide, the difference to go up to 4.5 is only 1 inch, so you actually you definitely need 1, 2 lengths of 2x4 for this, 3, 4, and 5 to make the add-on part, and then 6 to do this 3.5 inch one. So again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, sharing a piece there, and 6. You could potentially do this with 6 2x4s of 8-foot length and still have some scrap left over. The front panel has a notch cut in it, so you can use, you know, a jigsaw or something like that. A bandsaw would work, except it's a pretty big sheet to have on a bandsaw. But anyway, you've got to make a 11 inch by 1 inch notch centrally located along the long edge. And this is clearance for the protruding rear of the center console, just so it's not too close. I don't want it potentially rubbing into it, and this also gives a little greater access to the USB ports and things that are on the rear of the console. If you had something on your cargo floor that you wanted to plug in there, it would make it just a little easier to get your fingers in there. So the notch is useful, and more importantly, that notch is very useful for getting a grip on this front panel when you're trying to move it around, both during assembly fabrication of it, and also when you're trying to put it in storage, if you take it in and out of the vehicle, having that notch there helps a lot, because it also interrupts the 2x4 joist that runs across here. So the 2x4 joist here goes all the way from one end of the board up to the edge of the notch. Then another one goes from there to the end of the board. So it's a gap in both the joist and the plywood. But of course the gap in the plywood's only about 1 inch wide, whereas of course the 2x4 is 1.5 inches wide. The rear end of the front panel also has a joist, but it's only 4.5 inches high as opposed to 5.5 inches here, and that has to do with the sort of stair-step shape of the Odyssey's floor, where to get a relatively level floor you need to have these joists of different heights. To fit this panel in between the two sliding side doors, you want to have it go as close as possible, so when you're loading things from the side doors you don't have to lean in too far to get them up on this panel. But because of the shape of the plastic inside the sliding doors, you have to taper off the corners, all 4 corners. And those are, as it says, 1 by 2 or 1 by 3 inches. So you go over 1 and down 3, and then do the same thing all 4 corners. And that applies to the plywood and to the joist underneath. On mine, I used the glue and screw method. I used wood glue to go from the edge of the joist up against the plywood, and then about every 5 inches or so I put a deck screw in, so it would go through the 3/4 inch thickness of the plywood and then at least a couple inches into the joist. Same thing with the joist on the rear edge. Now for the rear panel, it's a little more complicated. It also has 2 joists, and the front one is 4.5 inches, just like the rear one on the front panel. And then as the floor of the Odyssey steps up higher and higher as it goes towards the rear, this joist, which is centrally located on the panel, is only 3.5 inches, or the width of a 2x4. So in this case you don't have to cut the 2x4 at all. Now I will point out that to make these 3 joists, I don't recommend just butting the edge of one 2x4 up to another one. I recommend running them down your table saw or your circular saw and shaving off that little, 1/8 of an inch where it's rounded over, so you have a nice smooth square surface to glue up to the adjacent 2x4, which has also got an edge cleaned up. That's the way I did mine, and I think it's good to do it that way. Now this one here, while it would be ideal to have the one that's going to be glued here to be flat, it needs to be 3.5 inches, and there's nothing you can cut off a single 2x4 there that will allow it to be 3.5 inches after the cutting. So in this case, oh well. As shown late in the video, and I did not do mine this way, but I would recommend anybody else do theirs this way, is set the front joist on the rear panel 1/4 inch back from the front edge of the panel. That is because when I took the initial measurements for all of this stuff and did the calculations, it ended up being off ever so slightly in terms of height. And as a result, where the front of the rear panel and the rear of the front panel meet, this one's going to be at one angle and the rear panel is going to be at just a slightly different angle with it. This is exaggerating it, but it goes up like this and then like that. So it's not 100% flat. And because it's got that slight upward arch to it, if you have both of these joists right up against the edges of the plywood, they'll touch at their bottom corners, and it'll force, because of that slight angle, it'll mean that the plywood does not mate. It'll end up being about 1/4 of an inch apart. So in order to get the plywood to meet up with the plywood without a gap, you need to offset this joist by 1/4 of an inch in this direction. So lessons learned the hard way in my case. In my instance, it doesn't really matter that much if there's a 1/4 inch gap there. So I'm just living with it, but anybody else can learn from my mistake and put that in there. Now, this panel here does not have a joist at the rear end, because the sill of the rear hatch on the van acts as the final or rear joist. This will sit right down on that, so that's why there's not another one back here. You can see in the course of 59.5 inches from rear sill to this point, the floor of the Odyssey drops by 4.5 inches. Okay, this joist here, besides being made out of a single 2x4, also needs to be narrower. It doesn't go all the way to the edges of the plywood. It's about 3.5 inches shorter than the width, than the 4-foot width. The reason for that is there is a lip on the plastic that forms the two sides of the rear cargo area of the van, and if you had this joist going all the way to the edge, it would ride up on that lip and it wouldn't fit properly, so you have to make it that much narrower to avoid that lip. That's another thing I learned the hard way. I did not detect that situation in my initial measurements, and I had to alter mine after fabrication by that amount to make it fit. There are seat belts that come up from the floor right about this spot and this spot, and to keep this plywood, which is almost the width, the plastic sides of the cargo area are just a hair, you know, maybe a 1/16 inch on each side wider than the plywood. So you don't want to pinch the seat belt material, which goes up from the floor and then up for the shoulder straps or the shoulder belts on the second row seats. You need to give those a place where they can pass through without getting damaged by this cargo floor. So there's these notches here. The dimensions are here, and they're about a 1/2 inch deep. 2 places. To help grab this and pick it up and pull it backwards when you want to remove it from the van, there's a couple of hand grips here. There's slots. I drill 2 round holes with a Forstner bit, or you could use a spade bit or an auger or any number of things that would make a round hole. I recommend 1 1/4 inches wide or in diameter, and then use a saber saw or something like that to connect the edges of the circles to make this oblong or rounded end slot in these 2 places, and these are not symmetrical. The distance of this one to the right side and this one to the left side are not the same. So if you follow these, pay attention to these dimensions. The rear end of the slot is 4 1/4 inches from the rear edge of the panel. And then if you use the 1 1/4 inch wide slot like I recommended, then of course it'll be that much further to the front. Let's see. I mentioned that when you are picking this one up, it's useful to be able to, for example, get one hand under this and then grab the top end and carry it in a horizontally oriented position like that. That's a good way to transport it. For example, if you have to take them in and out of your vehicle, it's only the work of a few minutes. It's fairly easy to do, but the panels are large enough it's hard to get a grip on them with both hands unless you have something to grab them by. So once again, because the joist does not continue through this notch area, it gives you an area where all you have is that 3/4 inch thick piece of plywood. You can definitely get your hand around that and get a good grip. And then the other hand can, because you're going to hold it at a bit of an angle, can then reach around the back of this joist there. On this one, these two hand grip slots are obvious places where you can grab it, as are these two notches for the seat belts. And you're going to put some wooden dowels in two places. Those are additional grip points. And finally, there's this dashed area here, which is 13 inches by 6 inches, and it's located 22 inches from the left side of the rear panel and 46 inches from the rear side of the panel. You want to mark that area on the plywood and perforate it with a lot of air holes, because the van has a 3-zone heating and air conditioning system, and while it blows air into the 3rd zone, which is the rear seating zone, through vents that are not on the floor, its ideal air return vent is right about here on the floor. Obviously the air can go other ways to get there, but when this panel's in place, except for tiny gaps along the edges, this is a pretty much closed box you're making on the floor. So you're basically going to take whatever fan is trying to draft air from that whole rear area back into the HVAC system and block it. You're going to make the HVAC system much less efficient for that whole rear section of the vehicle if you don't let some air go through this area. So in mine, I just used a large Forstner bit and made a bunch of holes. Probably more than it really needs, but that's the area where you'd want to make them. And once you've made them, especially if you make larger holes, again like 1.125 1.5 inches, something like that, then they're big enough to easily get your fingers in a couple of them and get a grip on that part of the panel as well. So I found having those holes there was very advantageous for transporting these and getting them in and out of the vehicle and so on. This panel, when you put it in, you tip it up on this side and you slide it into the vehicle through either of the side doors in the area just forward of the middle row seat or second row seat rails, just forward of that. Although these tapered corners are there for a different reason, they do help when you're sliding in, because it makes it, it makes it slide up on the carpeting and whatever much more smoothly. There isn't a sharp edge there to dig in to the carpeting, so it definitely helps get it in and out of the vehicle. Once you've slidden it in, then you just lower this side. You just tip it down so it's laying on the floor. And so that's the way you get that one in. It's pretty easy, and there is enough of an area over in the corners to grip it and lift it back up to vertical and then grab it and pull it back out. This panel, when you're transporting it and putting it in, you will lift this edge up onto the rear sill of the rear hatch and then grab it by these two slotted hand grips, lift and push forward, and it should slide easily down to the front, at which point these dowel rods will go into the corresponding holes in this joist and lock the two panels together. It won't be possible for this one to jump up above this one, for example, in a very hard braking situation or frontal collision. Everything fits in there so tightly that it should not be able to do that. At least that was my intention with the design. It also forces the floor to be flat across the gap between these two panels. Now I used about 1 3/8 inch diameter wood dowel from the hardware store. I made it a little bit longer than 3 inches so that it could go all the way through the 1.5 inch thickness of this joist and through the 1.5 inch thickness of this joist, and then protrude, stick out a little bit beyond that. They're glued into the holes in this joist and fit freely into these. Now, to make it actually go in there easily, I just took a strip of sandpaper and pulled it around and around this protruding section of dowel just a little bit, just took its diameter down ever so slightly, and that helps it fit in. I also used a belt sander to put a taper, almost like a bullet head shape, on the front to help it find the holes easier when you're plugging it together, so it's sort of like automatically aligning. Because this panel is slid in this way, there's a certain amount of force trying to push these joists to the rear, or to push them the other way when you're pulling it back out of the vehicle. So to make them stronger than just the glue and screw fastening, I put buttresses on the rear sides of both of these joists. The rear ones are 3 by 4 inches, 3 this way, 4 this way. The rear ones are 2 by 3, 2 inches, 3 inches. So they don't go all the way down to the bottoms of the joists. They stay clear of that. And I made 4 of them for each joist and spaced them out pretty much equally along the length. Because this joist is shorter, of course they'll be spaced closer. I actually put them slightly inboard, maybe like an inch inboard of the ends, and then found whatever spacing was necessary to get the other 2 buttresses, and same kind of thing here. I used wood glue and also pin nails, but you could use brad nails or something else to help make these fit in there really tightly and strongly. There's one other thing that needs to be made, and that's a pair of spacers. Both of these panels put together with the rear end right up on the sill as far back as it can go without hitting the inside of the rear door. The front of it is still a few inches from hitting the backs of the front seat rails. And to make sure that you can still move the seats back as far as they can go without hitting something on this panel, I made sure that the panel does not go too far forward. But this whole assembly could conceivably move to the front if you have heavy braking. And to prevent that from happening, there's these 2 spacers that go here and here, just on either side of this notch. And each of the spacers has sort of a cutout in it that fits around one of the seat rails. So here's the front passenger seat rail. The inner one, the center console, is right here, and it goes around the rear of this rail. And then under the driver's seat, there's the inner rail close to the center console, and the other spacer goes around that. And the rear of those spacers is exactly the right position to bump up against the front edge of this joist and thereby prevent forward motion. Alright, I've got my 2 pieces of plywood cut now, and after lunch I'm going to put them back in, make sure the dimensions are still correct, and then do some of the trim work. I'm going to put a couple of hand grips on the rear piece. I've already taken the dimensions. By the way, they're not symmetrical. If you just measure from one side, figure out where the hand grip should be, and then measure from the other side, they won't line up. And what I mean by that is that they won't line up with the recesses that are the hand grips to raise the 3rd row seats back up. And I think those are important because they let you get a better grip under the edge of the plywood before lifting and pulling it back out of the vehicle. So just, if you do something similar, make sure you take measurements from both ends. And at least one side of this will probably have to be tapered slightly. I'm also thinking about picking up a round over router bit. I don't know that that's really necessary. I'm still pondering it, but maybe at least for the back edge here, because that's where things will be first slid onto it, and along these edges here and the opposite one for the same reason. Alright, I've used my table saw to shave off just a little bit of the one edge, so instead of having a rolled over edge, it's a nice straight edge. That'll be for gluing up, because I need to make 5.5 inch and 4.5 inch rails, spacers, whatever we're calling them, and one 2x4 won't do it. You could save this effort by going and buying a bigger piece of lumber, but I didn't think it was going to have to be that high initially. And I've got 2 pieces glued up there. I'm using most of my clamps, so I have to do the other 2 pieces later on. This one will probably be for the 5.5 inch. The other 2 pieces will make the 4.5 inch, and everything else will be a lot smaller, but I still need to buy more wood. And here's the other one. This is the one that'll be the 4.5, I think. Alright, here's the piece that goes between the 2 side doors. Its dimensions are 63 inches long. That's from side to side in the vehicle. And 33.25 wide. That's front to rear in the vehicle. Each corner has a notch taken out of it that's 3 inches deep and 1 inch wide. That's a lot of variation in this area, could be the case. Then there's an 11-inch wide notch that's 1 inch deep, that's centered along the long direction. That's to give a little more clearance around the center console, just in case this shifts, that it doesn't actually bump up against it and do some damage. That's the only reason that notch is there. Okay, here's the piece test fit in the vehicle. The notches at the corners are more critical in front, not so much in the rear, but it helps when swinging this into place in the vehicle that you're not gouging the plastic with the corner of the wood. That's the reason I took the notches out on the rear side. It just makes it a little easier to maneuver when getting it into place. Okay, these are the 2 rails. I'm going to try to call them by that name going forward. For the front piece that goes crosswise between the side doors. This is 5.5 inches from here to here, 4.5 inches from there to there, and they're both 63 inches long. They're made out of 2x4s with the curved edges cut off on my table saw, and they're glued together to make them taller. You could actually use one 2x4 to make this piece and this piece if you cut it carefully. Anyway, I've decided that I'm going to notch the front one, that's the 5.5-inch one, into two pieces, so I have an additional gap to go with the notch in the front edge of the plywood. So I have to cut these down and take 11 inches out of the overall length. And I'm also going to decide which end is the bottom and put a little ramp on there, so if you're sliding it in to the vehicle, you don't just have this hard edge digging into the carpet. Alright, there's the front crosswise platform with the 5.5-inch riser on there. The 11-inch notch, the tapered ends, the rolled over edges on all corners, glued and screwed using deck screws. Now I'm gonna use a router bit, which I haven't bought yet, to round these edges over, but not the edge that's going to abut the other platform. I may roll this one over. I'm thinking of adding just a piece of plywood, like right here, to act as kind of a barrier to things sliding forward. Not sure yet. Getting some drain tile put in. So this can be slid in to the van through the side doors like this, and then tipped into position. Doing it the way I did it, with the risers here, with this notched 1 inch in and 3 inches that way, the riser also notched the same way using a bandsaw, and the bottom edge just touches the plastic surround there, and it has about a 1/2 inch clearance there. Good clearance here. Even if it slides forward a bit, it's not going to hit that and do any damage. And it's right on my tape line, so it's right where it needs to go. Now I have to start making the risers, rails, whatever, for the rear piece. Alright, the 3.5 inch riser, which is the rearmost one in the middle of the rear platform, I decided to not square off the 2x4 because the 2x4 is naturally 3.5 inches. I'm just going to leave that one the way it is, cut to 4 foot length. Then I have another 8 foot 2x4 cut in half and glued together with squared off edges. That'll make the 4.5 riser for the front of the rear plywood section. That'll match up with the 4.5 inch riser on the rear of the front platform. Alright, this is a test fit of the rear piece. I've got notches for the seat belts, just so the wood is not rubbing up against the seat belts and, you know, wearing through the seat belt mesh or something. So that's what that's for. And there are ventilation holes there which go above the what I think is the cold air return vent, or just the air conditioning return vent on the floor. It's off to one side, so you have to measure that more carefully, which I did not do here. I had marked and measured this, and then I ended up flipping it upside down in the course of doing everything, and I transcribed the dimensions. And look at that, son of a gun. The holes are in the wrong place. I need to elongate those holes by about 1.25 inches so that I can get my hands in there. I could do it now, but it'd be better if I come over a bit. Same thing here. So I think these holes are not symmetrical, and I knew that before, but somehow I screwed up transcribing them from the bottom of that side to the top of this side. So need to make an adjustment, but at least it's correct this way, and everything sits just about where I expect it to be here. Once the glue is set for the built-up 4.5 inch spacer there, then I can put that on, and also the one that kind of goes across. I've got some marks right about there. It goes across here, and that'll support that as well, as so one spacer there and one at that end, and this end it just sits right on this firm rear step of the cargo door. So I think that'll work out pretty well. Once I get the front rail spacer, I keep forgetting what I'm calling it. Once I get that in there, I'm figuring I'm going to get a length of hardwood dowel from the hardware store and put probably two will be enough, holes that match up with the rear rail on that and the front rail on this one, or the rear spacer and the front spacer. Drill through and then glue in the short stubs of dowel, and that'll form an alignment tool. So when I put that part in and slide this one in, those will help center it, which isn't that important because it's pretty well centered anyway. It can't really go sideways, but what I wanted to do is make sure that the two pieces are locked together. If I put any weight on them, one won't sag down a little bit. It'll keep the top of the two plywood pieces flush with each other. That's the point of putting those in. Alright, there's the rear section with the risers on there, glued and screwed just like the other one, but this one being slid in with the direction of travel going crosswise to these, it's going to put more strain on them. Even though I think they're strong enough with the screws and the glue, I'm going to put a little buttress on each one just to give it a little extra strength. And I'm going to make that out of some of this scrap 3/4 inch plywood. Alright, the buttresses are on there now, glued and pin nailed. And it's twilight, and it's time to stop for the day. Alright, I have both platforms laying upside down on the garage floor, the reasonably flat part of it, the 4.5 inch high risers where the two join are obviously matching up properly, and with the 63 inches that way and the 48 inches that way, I found the center and marked it, made sure those are lined up, measured 7.5 inches from each side to make sure they were in fact centered. And now I'm going to put through the holes for some dowel rods for alignment pins. Alright, I have some 1.8 inch diameter dowel, wooden dowel. I've cut it so it's about 1 inch longer than it takes to get through both pieces, and that's so that even if the two slide apart a little bit, they'll still engage fully. I've drilled a pilot hole at both places to make sure everything's still in alignment, and now I'm going to chuck up a 1 1/8 inch Forstner bit and drill those holes out. Okay, there are those two holes and these two holes, so I'm assured that they're in alignment now. Now I'm going to epoxy these in on this side, and because they're tapered, they should be able to center themselves when pushing the two together. Well, I semi-booger that up. I let the glue go for about 5 minutes to set up partially, and then I pushed two halves together to make sure that the pins were really in alignment so they wouldn't go in, engage too firmly. And that managed to push the plugs back out a little bit. The epoxy was almost hard, but not enough to keep it from pushing back a bit. So I whacked it a few times with a sledgehammer and got it partially back in, and then the glue was just setting up and it wouldn't budge. So I left it sticking out a little bit. When it gets fully cured, I'll use my pull saw and just smooth it off a little bit. For good measure, I put in a 4-inch deck screw that I drilled almost all the way through. I drilled it down through the wood here, through the dowel, and then just a hair beyond that, and there's still a good inch of screw actually threading into the wood on the other side, so that'll make sure these don't pull out of the wrong piece. So it's kind of a good measure kind of thing. Alright, I've done a round over routing on all sharp edges. I've put some spar urethane varnish down, just one thick coat. It's out in the sunlight, it'll dry pretty quickly. Everything except for what'll be the top surface, which is currently the bottom surface. Where it looks white there, that's where some glue got on it. This is the same. Here's the product I purchased to line my cargo floor. It's I believe it's a JB Weld product, although I don't really see it prominently mentioned. The brand is Herculiner, the original roll-on bed liner kit. Non-skid protection against scratches, dents, and rusts. Kit contains 1 gallon of Herculiner coating, an application brush, 2 application rollers, a roller handle. You just clean, mask, sand, scuff the surface. It's wood already, so it doesn't need scuffing. Roll on Herculiner coating, dries in 4 hours. That's about right. If I get it on pretty soon, it should be pretty much ready. It's supposed to rain tomorrow, so I need to get it back inside, but it'll be out in the sun today. High scratch and impact resistance, great adhesion to sheet metal or aluminum truck beds. Heavy textured skid resistance. Excellent chemical and water resistance, not just for truck beds. bumpers, fenders, panels, wheel wells, undercarriage, Jeeps and open vehicles, steps, sidewalks, and walkways and decks, trailers, boats. And although it doesn't say it real obviously here, the website says it's good for, in addition to pretty much any painted metal or bare metal, it's good for wooden surfaces, plastics, all sorts of stuff. And since they mentioned decks, it should be just fine for this application. So we get a brush, a couple of rollers and a handle, and the 1 gallon container. 1 gallon of Herculiner covers 1 6-foot standard truck bed. Extended 8-foot beds need an additional quart. Can be applied between 32 degrees Fahrenheit and 95 degrees Fahrenheit. 2 coats are required for adequate coverage and performance. So I'm hoping that this will do these 2 panels. I think together they're about the size of a truck bed, so I think it should be enough. Recommended to have a paint tray, acetone for surface preparation, I won't need that. Disposable gloves. Have to let the first coat dry between 1 and 4 hours until no longer tacky. Discard the first roller, second coat, use the second roller after the first coat is completely dry. Must be applied within 24 hours after the first coat, otherwise you will need to clean and scuff the first coat prior to application. So I've used some of the scrap 3/4 inch plywood that was cut off by the lumber yard so that it would fit into my van, and I'd had them cut off 8 inches, so I've trimmed those down to 6 identical pieces that are 7 3/8 inch the long way and 6 inches the short way. I'm going to laminate these into 3 blocks, each 2 1/4 inches tall, and once the glue dries on those, then I'm going to notch them out, and these will be spacers that go behind the inner rear rail of the front seats and abut against the front riser on the front platform. That'll prevent it from sliding forward over time. Alright, those blocks are glued. I put some pin nails through to keep them aligned, and then I'm clamping them. Now it's time to go roll the coating on the wood out there. Alright, the first coat is on. I put along the edges that'll be visible, including these beveled edges, and a little bit on the inside, just so it doesn't look like it goes straight from bare wood to coated wood. I didn't have very good luck getting the stuff to go inside these holes. I'm going to have to try something different during the second coat. There's no need to put anything on these surfaces, they'll be hidden. And these surfaces here, the long edges of the rear platform, those will be rubbing up against the inside panels of the van, so it really doesn't need, or probably shouldn't have, the gritty coated surface on that. I got a much better coat inside the hand grips here than I did on there, so definitely have to do something with a better brush on that. I tried just using a dowel rod with a scrap of t-shirt wrapped around it, and that just didn't work. Alright, with these blocks dried, there's a notch in here, trapezoidal notch. It's 1 inch here, 1 inch here, 2 or 3.5 inches here, and 2 inches deep. So over 1 inch, drop down at an angle, 3.5, go back up at an angle, 1 inch, 3.5 inches here, 2 inches there. That should nestle around the rear rail for the front row seats. Alright, there are those 2 blocks. And I just realized I made a mistake with these. I went to the wrong side of the tape. God darn it. Shoot. I think I went to the wrong side of the tape. No, I'm not sure. Have to double check that. Yeah, I think I went to the wrong side of the tape. The other piece comes to this side, not that side. Oops. I'll have to adjust that. But you can see how it fits around the seat rail, so the seat can come back pretty far yet before it runs into that. And it's actually just below that, so it can probably actually extend out over a little bit. This is lower than the bottom of the rail by just a 1/16 of an inch or something, so I think it actually could roll back over that if it's allowed to. Alright, I've whipped up a couple more spacers that'll go on the ends of these, make them 1 inch deeper or wider. I'm thinking of just putting those in with a couple screws instead of actually gluing them on. Alright, the second coat's on. I had to move them inside because rain's forecast, and based on how long it took for the first coat to get non-tacky, is about 4 hours out in the direct sunlight, and there wasn't that much direct sunlight left today, so had to bring it inside the garage to do it. Tomorrow will be raining, so I'll have all day tomorrow to dry too. Hopefully that'll do it. Alright, now with the 1 inch spacers added, I'm still debating on how to attach these. Shouldn't need much, I just don't want them gradually sliding out to the side or rising up or something. So I think some sort of screw or pin or something should be sufficient. Okay, the way I decided to do it was with some 3/8 inch dowel, cut 2 inches long. 1/2 goes into the shim, whatever we're calling this, and 1/2 goes into the hole, which is drilled about 1.25 inches deep with a 3-inch Forstner bit. I have the orientation and association marks. That one's called right because these aren't done with precision machine tools and the spacing may be slightly off, so these are matched up. And I've epoxied them into the shims here, and while the epoxy is drying, I've got them in here just to assure that they dry in alignment, as I've done here. And I've slapped a coat of varnish on there. I used the same spar urethane I used on the platform since I had it handy. Alright, I have the extended spacers. I have the rear panel and the front panel. I also have a couple old beach towels, or good sized bath towels anyway. They need to be about 4 feet long from end to end. So I need to take out my temporary marking tape. That's moot now. In order to avoid having to have a crosswise support for the two ribs or spacers, the one that goes here and the one that goes up there, I intended to have the two second row seat sliding carriages to their outermost positions. So the handle here provides some support for the middle section of the plywood. If somebody really wanted to, there's just enough room to squeeze in maybe something really narrow in this area, but the door comes to right around here. I suppose you could put a piece of 1/2-inch plywood or something, but then it's going to sit on this ridge here, which is probably not structural, so I intended this to take a little bit of weight. So that's the way these two spacers fit in there. And now the front platform goes in, and the side with the notch on it here will be the bottom when it's slid in, so it'll be slid on this side in a vertical or upright position, and then it'll be tipped over towards the rear. This notch here, in addition to giving more clearance around the center console and not having a piece going through here, gives you a handhold to carry this. So if you come on one side and reach under the rear edge, you can reach forward and grab this edge, tip it up, and carry it that way. Of course, that's the end you want to put in on the bottom, so that's a little upside down, but at least you can carry it in that position. When actually putting this in, once again, this will be the bottom for the purpose of sliding it in. And at this point, it can just be lifted from the inside edge of this rear rail. So here I'm just sliding it in from the side. Until it gets to about that position. You can see where the notch is relative to that protuberance there. You want to get it more or less equal spaced. And then rotate it down. Probably need to lift it a little bit to get it to scooch in that direction. Another way to visualize it is that this edge here should be roughly halfway from this decorative or anti-skid ridge to this one. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and this goes roughly in the middle there. And you can't really go too far backwards, because if you've done this angle right, it's resting along the bottom of this panel, and on this side it's resting against these two spacers that prevent it from sliding forward. See, this one's in the same place, roughly halfway down there. I misspoke before. An earlier version of this I had intended for the wood to sit down on this handle, but in this version of it I brought it up higher so that it would have a little clearance. It's only really about an inch of clearance in there. When lifting the rear platform, you can use either of these two pull-out hand grips and any of these holes here to grab it. And if you're grabbing it by the edge, these seat belt notches also make good hand grips. When lifting this into the car, grabbing it down here, kind of under this buttress here, and through these holes seems to work pretty well. Once you've got the weight of the front sitting up here on the sill, keep in mind that these two protruding dowels have to go in those two holes. When you're sliding it in, you have to finesse it a bit of an angle so that it clears that seat belt over there, and then reach in and pull the seat belt past on that corner. Then you can continue sliding it in. Need to keep the weight down in the rear so those two rails in the front kind of ride up in space. For the towel slash small blanket, I've got it folded in half and laid out here. It's a couple inches wider on each end. So what I'm going to do is tuck it under here and then bring these areas up through the tiny gap on both sides, which will probably help prevent any rattling noises. So there it is, complete. Even with the towel down here, there's still enough space down into the recesses in the backs of the third row seats to get your hand down in here and under the lip to grab this and tug it backwards to disengage it from the front platform. This seems to be pretty quiet back here. Now there was a small glitch here which I did not anticipate. You can see this small gap here, and that's caused by the fact that there's small misalignment in the height of these ridges or these spacers here, and that causes this part to be just a hair too high relative to the front and rear. So it actually comes up and then has a small break in the slope, a very small one, but over the length here it manifests itself as about a not quite a 1/4 inch gap at the top. You can close that up, except the bottom there touches at the bottom. You can't get it any closer than that. So if I was to do this again, I would probably take this front rib on the rear platform and move it back maybe a 1/4 inch from the actual front edge. Still do the dowel rods for alignment. I think that would make all the difference in cleaning that up. But otherwise, it's not going anywhere. I don't think it's going to be noisy, you know, rattling around. I've taken every precaution that I can to alleviate noises from these panels moving while driving. So once again, there's very little space there. If you have anything up on this cargo floor, then nothing's going to fall off the ends of it if it has any size to it at all, because it'll be by design right up, you know, a 1/4 inch away from the inside door panels. And that's the way it looks from the inside with the rear hatch closed. Alright, I'm just doing a test drive here to see how quietly this cargo bed rolls on various road surfaces. So far I can't hear a peep out of it, but this is not a very bumpy road. I actually just went through a car wash. My van had been sitting outside getting coated with a thick layer of pollen for quite a while, and that wasn't really being helped that much by the rain. It gets it wet, but it doesn't really wash a lot of it off. So I thought, hey, there's no lines at the car wash on a rainy day, so I can get that right through there. So far quiet back there. I'm going to take it on a rougher country road and then the interstate for a little bit, and then a bit more local roads that I know are kind of bumpy. Just try it out on every kind of road I can find in my general area. But I need to put some gas in this car. It's low. I should have done it when I went to the car wash. This is part of the Temple Farms, a large estate in the general vicinity. They used to have a large herd of Lipizzan horses here. They quit doing that a couple years ago, and I haven't seen any horses out here since then, so I'm guessing they got rid of them. But that used to be a big point of that part of the farm, was the raising and you know, breeding, training of Lipizzan horses. Not really sure what happened to stop that. This stretch of US Highway 41 has a number of lateral bumps. You probably can't hear them, but I can certainly feel them. There was a good one. And I haven't heard a peep from the cargo floor. It's not knocking or squeaking or rattling or anything like that, so far so good. Just coming up where US Highway 41 merges with I-94 at the Wisconsin border. It'll get me a little bit of the experience of what I should expect from this cargo floor on smooth high-speed highways, which in other words, I don't expect to hear anything from it. But I want to test it on all the surfaces I can. Not a peep back there. We're up here in Bristol, Wisconsin, going past the huge complex, it seems like it goes on forever, of warehouses associated with the U-Line company. I used to go bicycling on this road, and then it got kind of busy with all the industrial traffic, so I shifted routes. Yeah, they've improved this road. It's not as rough as I thought it was going to be. Okay, we're down to State Line Road here. Illinois on the left, Wisconsin on the right, although I think technically the state line is just one side or the other of the road, not right down the middle, but yeah. This also used to be a good biking road, but these days it's always got too much traffic on it. But there are plenty of other roads going in the same direction, just a little bit north or south. Get out on my cat trike and ride these areas a lot, if not this specific road. This road is less improved. I've got some good knocks and shaking of the vehicle that are not making any noise from the cargo floor. Wish I could go a little faster, but the car 2 cars up is dragging ass here. This is a road I ride on, as is this one here. This one's a pretty good surface, but it'll have a few bumps here and there, as I recall. One thing I like about this stretch of road is it has some pretty large equestrian farms that are pleasant to ride by. Can't really see much of it now, but back to Highway 45 now, US 45. Just again hunting for road surfaces that are different combinations of bumps and shakes and cracks and potholes and things. This has got some nice bumps on it here. I can hear the tires hitting the bumps, but cargo bed is making no noise. They've repaved this section of US Highway 173 since the last time I was on it. It used to be really rough. Now it's, well, it was paved up to that point. Now it's rough again. Yeah, this road's a good test. You can probably see and hear in the video that it's a rough piece of road. Now we're back to a place where I often go riding with my cat trike or my high wheel bike. There's a road down here called Savage Road that just a farm road, but it's used to be very rough and gravelly, and ever since they put a housing development on it, it's paved and pretty nice road to ride on. Right about in the middle of my ride, usually I'll utilize that road, but you can't get on from there. That's a dead end, so I have to ride the shoulder of 173 over here to get to that intersection. Luckily it's a really wide shoulder. And I came this way because they're doing road resurfacing up here. And it's gonna have some nice grooved pavement, probably with a fair number of bumps. Well, I've done about 60 miles noodling around on various roads within the county and into Wisconsin, and since none of those have elicited any noise from the new cargo floor, I'm counting that a success in that regard.